Welcome to City Cinematheque, where the art and pleasure of the movies are the subject of serious discussion. I'm your host, Jerry Carlson, and I teach film studies at the City College of the City University of New York. Today it's our pleasure to present the 1957 film, The Wide Blue Road, directed by Gillo Pontecorvo, perhaps best known for his masterpiece, The Battle of Algiers. This is his first feature film, and it's a film that was rediscovered by the distinguished American director Jonathan Demme, who fell in love with it and brought it into distribution in the United States over 40 years after its original debut in Europe. It's a film that stars three great actors, Yves Montand, Alida Valli, and Francisco Rabal, and it's a film that has a relationship with Italian neorealism, but with some other differences as well. We'll be able to talk about that and a host of other things after today's screening. It's a pleasure to welcome back to CUNY TV Professor Pellegrino D'Acierno from Hofstra University, a noted expert on contemporary and modern Italian culture. Now, take this opportunity to sail the wide blue road. Welcome back from the Wide Blue Road. It's a pleasure to have with us today someone returning after a few years, unfortunately, but we should make that gap a little bit briefer, to City Cinematheque, our friend Pellegrino D'Acierno. Pelle is a professor of comparative literature at Hofstra University, and in the academic year 2006-2007 will be a visiting professor at NYU. He's the author of numerous books and articles on Italian literature and film, Italian American culture, one of his interests, as well as you have to say, your broader interest, Pelle, is simply in contemporary culture. Welcome back to City Cinematheque.
Thank you. It's wonderful to see you again.
Good. Let's start out with just the question of this as a political. Is this an Italian political film or not? There's some debate over that issue. Set the terms of debate for us and sort of walk us through this.
Well, it's complicated in many respects because the film has certain contradictions to it. It's designed as a political film. It's in a sense a Marxist parable. Right. You could describe it as it's coming out of the neorealist context. It's a social realist film, but also a social realist film. Right. It's a social problem film and broadly political, but and it has a very strict Marxist message. Right. I mean, it's a perfect exemplification of a classical Marxism. The thesis of the individual versus the collective. Right. And at the end,
Yves Montand versus Francisco Rabal.
Okay. Exactly. And he, of course, is a prisoner or an exponent of false consciousness. He's trapped within the false consciousness. The film is an allegory about the undoing of that false consciousness and coming finally at the end to some awareness of a collective will, and that as he says at the end, that the real bombs are the nets and the cooperative. Right. So that would be the real way of towards the new social future. Okay. A slow revolution, by the way, not the fast revolutions that he'll set out, that Pontecorvo will set out later on in both Battle of Algiers and Bern. Right. Right. Okay. So where does the contradiction come into this in terms of the debate? Well, the contradiction, it comes in, of course, whether you're shooting something different. It's always the same problem, that ratio between whether you shoot something, you can shoot something different. Here we can say the proletariat, the worker, the fisher, really. Right. It's not a factory worker, by the way, which is where films of workerism would mostly be based. Right. Instead, fishermen belong to the peasantry, and there's a long argument in Italian culture about this, based on Gramsci. Gramsci would turn to this alliance between the fisherman, the peasant, and the worker. He thought that was the way towards the future. So the film is coming out of that leftist culture of the 50s. Right. Gramscian, Marxist. Pontecorvo is a communist until 56, just about the time of the release of the film.
Right. And so this is also a film that's interesting to put it in the context of what's happening in Italy in the late in the late 50s, because we have this economic transformation, this rapid industrialization, which is known as Il Boom, Il Boom in Italy. So this film, in a certain sense, looks a little bit backwards towards certain aspects of its neo-realist roots. Clearly, there's anybody who knows the work of Visconti and his great film about the fisherman, La Terra Trema. This sort of is set up as, is this La Terra Trema 2, or is this, some kind of signifying on, commentary on it? But what it is not about is that urban proletariat. And it's not about those conflicts that are going to come up in the countryside as it's turned into an urban environment. We're really out here with the fishermen.
Absolutely. And in that sense, it is a rewriting of La Terra Trema in many ways. But in terms of, interesting contradictions. You can no longer do neorealism at this point. I read a book recently that claimed that The Wide Blue Road was in fact a film of rosy neorealism, which is incorrect. In other words,
explain what that phrase means to people.
Well, it means an exploitive version of neorealism, by which the peasants are turned, are glamorized, spectacularized, presented in terms of bread, fantasy, et cetera, et cetera. And so the real political and social significance and the rigor of neorealism is lost. Remember, neorealism is a counter-cinema in some sense. It's always working against the dominant cinema. And what happens in the 50s, and what Pontecorvo's film represents, is this encounter with commercial cinema. And the compromises that you have to make with that cinema. He did not want to have a film in color, and he did not want to have a star system. Although in retrospect, I think it works out better for the film, because it emphasizes the contradictions. In other words, here you have a very didactic Marxist film, and then you have the leading man, Yves Montand, as a kind of relic or almost an index of capitalism, the compromises with capitalism that you have to make to make such a film at this time, when neorealism could no longer attract an audience. Strict neorealism. Well,
by the way, one of the interesting things also about that, to take it from the demands of production. So we've already talked about two things. I mean, the adaptation of the color. By the way, the film would seem to work better as The Wide Blue Road if you have color. The adaptation of the star system. We have, Yves Montand, Alida Valli, and Francisco Rabal, all of whom are well known within European cinema as stars. But then we also have the sort of contradiction that further comes with that, is we have a Frenchman, Yves Montand, mind you, of Italian origins.
Strictly Italian in body. He's that's a very Tuscan look. My son-in-law and his family would be brothers to that look. So that's one of the strange things. He's regarded as being bourgeois, as just having exited from a cabaret performance. But in fact, that is a very typical look, body. In other words, class body. He came from disadvantaged situations.
Absolutely.
His family is Marxist as he is, et cetera, et cetera. So those things have to be tempered.
But actually, the point I'm moving towards is the fact that by using the star system, this is an Italian film that is and is not an Italian film, because you have a person who's made his mark artistically in France. Yves Montand. Francisco Rabal is Spanish. He's made his mark. Now, he will give significant performances, as many of these people do, in these European co-productions of the 60s and 60s and 70s. And of course, Alida Valli is another. She's Italian, but of Austrian origin as well, and she crosses these boundaries. So this is. It's not just a star system. It's certainly that, but it's the fact that you have people of three different mixed international backgrounds who are stepping in there. So on the one hand, it works to the disadvantage of the neo-realist aesthetic, because they're stars and not of this. But on the other hand, it makes, from the producer's point of view, it makes the film and invariably its message, because it is a message film, travel better.
Yes.
And people see it as an allegory, as a Marxist allegory to be sure, an allegory in Europe, but an allegory that may be adaptable to other locations where this kind of thing is going on. And the star system allows you to enter into that.
To me, in retrospect, as we see the film, we've discovered the film after almost 50 years. The fact that you have a star, and the whole thing revolves around Montagne, is the contradiction that makes the film very, very interesting. In fact, we should mention that Squarciò signifies, the proper name signifies he tore. All right, so it's part of the allegory parable, but again, there are all sorts of tears in the social fabric. All right, and he winds up, one way or another, victimizing a whole series of characters, of associates, friends. I won't, starting with Domenico, the first lover of his daughter Diana, and then going down through the first Coast Guard marshal, the Santa Maria, who imitates his bombing. So there are a whole series of casualties, including finally himself and his family. So this notion of a tear or rent in the social fabric is key to understand. But I think in cinematic terms, you might want to see, push this metaphor to see a kind of rending of the film and cinema, these contradictions in the, particularly with neorealist aesthetics. In other words, you have the problem always of, here you have that rigorous non-style of neorealism, which is also a counter-style. It resists the dominant thing. Now it's becoming, it needs to become integrated into with dominant cinema. So now the problem becomes, how are you going to shoot the different, all right, in the language of the same? In other words, the different being, proletariat reality, the reality, the image of work, the image of the village, all of that stuff. The different, the politically and the class different, but in the same language. And this is what you have in this film, this kind of compromise, this, but very interesting. And then retrospectively, it becomes more interesting because the film's value is the performance of Montagne, as far as I'm concerned. And the fact that you have a star, he's a star or an exception, or someone, a tear in the rent, at the level of the sociological level of the film, but then also at the level of the linguistic level of the film. So to me, it's
well, it's also you bring up this very interesting point. For anybody who ever, I mean, Montagne is someone who had a magnificent career as a film actor. People think of him and remember him not so much for his Hollywood roles, but for some of the great international roles he had, such as Wages of Fear, the great Clouseau thriller, the Costa Gavras films, Z, and State of Siege. And if you know those films in which he's really at his height as a film actor, there is something, that star quality of being genuinely charismatic. And for those people, those lucky people who happen to be watching us, who had the experience of ever seeing him perform live, he is another one of those performers who had this enormous charisma. I mean, when he simply walked into a room, and it was a humility and charisma at the same time, which was part of his star persona, but was also part of his genuine his genuine persona. Well, that I'm saying he brings to the role. So he's going to be the defeated party in the Marxist Marxist parable. Well, what can make that more convincing is if you have somebody who invariably must be defeated, but who has this enormous charisma about them. You believe
he has all the energy. He should be the revolutionary.
That's exactly right.
And but it's, and he's so phallic as well. But and he's simpatico, and he's a good father, a good family man. He connects. It's extraordinary how he connects. On the other hand, he has a kind of angst that is rendered convincingly, or despite the awkward arrangement. There's a voiceover
Right.
in which we get into his head, and he's often positioned this way with the voiceover. And no, but he's a bearer of angst as well. So it's a very rich and deep role that he's.
Well, and while Montand was not a troubled man in any sense, he was a man who was highly professional. He was well known to have trained and rehearsed. He worked for everything. In terms of his cabaret performances, he was the kind of person who, he got ballet training, so he would have a sense of the appropriate movement, so he could choose movement in the right way. Though he was always aware of his origins. A friend recently told me an extraordinary story. Montand, who was leftist all of his life, was asked in the mid-50s to, and this is when he's a young man, enormously successful, he was actually asked by the Polish government to go give a concert for the workers. Well, in fact, he was being used by them. It was a setup because they were sort of bringing him in to placate the workers, and the workers were in a very testy mood, as indeed they should have been, given their conditions. He comes in and he gets booed by the Polish workers. And so one of the party officials, sort of took him under his wing after the concert. Montand was upset, and the official was saying, no, you got to understand their circumstances and their point of view. And Montand's response was, he said, "Oh, well, that's really interesting. Actually, I just thought it was a bunch of really savvy workers who figured out that I'm not such a good singer." He said, but this was Montand's actual words. He said, "I'm not such a good singer, but I'm a very good performer, and my performance covers up." So he was, he was a man who knew, about.
He was savvy.
He was savvy.
Well, he constructed one of the few cinematic persona that was political. Exactly, and it begins in this film. That's what's so remarkable about that. I mean, he was, a political agent finally in those other films of Costa Gavras. But here again, it's an extraordinary performance at many levels. But go ahead.
Okay. Well, let's segue, as they say in TV, from Montand to Pontecorvo, because this is Pontecorvo's first feature film. We've talked about the contradictions. Pontecorvo is somebody who's very interested in neorealism. He has to adapt. First of all, talk a little bit about Pontecorvo and his trajectory as a filmmaker. I mean, where does he go from here, and what does this do for him, and how does he change?
Well, I should say, in terms of the trajectory, it always tied back to neorealism, and then at the personal level, to his own status as he was a partisan, resistance fighter, a communist up until '56 or whatever, and all of that experience. Then it's interesting because of the feature films, Wide Blue Road is the only one dedicated to the Italian social context.
Okay.
All the on the other hand, the other films are situated elsewhere, in the third world.
Capo, Battle of Algiers, Bern are the important.
That's it, and also Ogre.
Ogre.
Yeah, which is Basque. But what it is that the Italian resistance is always there, or Italian elements are always being transcoded into the into the other geography, the other political geographies, and important to mention. But of course, what we have to deal with is the leap from the Wide Blue Road to Battle of Algiers and ultimately to Bern, which probably the two greatest political films of all time. And the passage from this kind of slow revolution that you see in the Wide Blue Road. In fact, you might want to think, the audience should think about the meaning of that Wide Blue Road. It obviously is a reference to the sea and the whole romance of the sea that's at work, the tracing of the lines in the sea by the boat. It's a metaphor for that, but also for revolution. And the revolution that's at the heart of the film is in fact a slow revolution, through the cooperative and not through violence. In fact, the bombs are used against the fish, against nature, and are part of the main character's alienation. Although he's not aware, he is really an exponent of false consciousness. He's not aware
Right.
of his own ideological position. He's just a rugged individualist, and therefore character who
and unaware of the damage that he does to the collective cause.
Absolutely.
I mean, you know, and because, hey, I'm going to have it my way, don't...
including himself.
Absolutely.
He's a character that ultimately destroys himself and his family, although
Right.
There's a touching last scene where he passes on his last will and testament, which is that the real bombs are the collective, and the
Right.
nets fishing within limits.
Right.
And so it's anyway, to go from that kind of cautious, it's classical Marxist my parable of social change to to Battle of Algiers, and which is this extraordinary film about decolonialization, and it is extraordinary at a cinematic level,
Right.
at the level of language. Because again, we talk about here you're filming the different,
Right.
thematically different, right? Decolonization in a language that I think is marked by difference.
Right.
So this produces, in my terms, the most profound, the most efficacious form of a political film.
Right.
When you have these double disturbances. And
well, very, very nicely put. And it's worth pointing out to folks, if they don't know it, that Battle of Algiers, which circulated for a number of years in degraded prints,
Right.
was completely restored, re-released several years ago on 35 millimeter. And if people really want to see it, it is available on a DVD, and you can see this kind of leap from an extremely interesting film like The Wide Blue Road to the double disturbance,
Right.
as you put it, of the Battle of Algiers. And I have to say that a film, for example, like Ridley Scott's Black Hawk Down, which treats this military incident in Mogadishu, is a film not possible without the kind of language that Pontecorvo is almost reinventing a new form of neorealism in the Battle of Algiers. It's also worth just reminding people, if they don't remember it, that Byrne...
I should say it's neorealism plus montage.
You bet.
And which is not the same that's happened, the new language that we have of, it's called intensive continuity, fast-paced, is not it does not produce the same kind of shock
Right.
and the same kind of assault that this particular combination of Pontecorvo's produces.
Absolutely the case. Now, just also to refresh people's memory, one of the extraordinary things about the following film, Byrne, is that it's coming back to what we were talking about this film, is that it stars Marlon Brando.
Right.
And it was actually one of Brando's favorite films. It was a film he always said, one of the films I'm proudest of is the film I made with Pontecorvo, in which you have in Byrne a major global Hollywood star who is another example of what we call not merely false consciousness, but a false protagonist, because he represents all the negative values of manipulative colonialism. And Pontecorvo, in that film, again has the bravery to have cast a black non-actor as the antagonist, or the actual genuine protagonist of the film, against this Hollywood star. So you end up in something like Byrne, available on cassette if people want to see it. You end up with literally this enactment of the Hollywood star versus the non-actor in the same story.
Who learns how to act as he learns how to decolonize, as it were.
Well, exactly.
And so it's extraordinary. And that film has it had all to do with the crowd scenes and the contagion of revolution, emancipation, liberation. There's no one that does that with the same force as Pontecorvo. That's why these arguments now about Battle of Algiers, for example, being regarded as insufficiently autonomous from first and second cinema. First cinema is dominant cinema, Hollywood cinema. Second cinema is art film.
Right.
And third cinema is, again, the cinema of absolute difference coming from the, not necessarily coming from the third world, but the cinema so marked by difference that
Right.
it falls out of those two categories. And of course, neorealism is so interesting in the sense, is that it opens the way as a cinema of refusals, as this kind of zero-degree language of cinema, to second cinema, to art film.
All right.
But at the same time, it opens a way to this other social, political cinema, the third cinema.
Right.
Because it is a counter cinema. It refuses so many other elements of the dominant cinema.
Let's. This is going to be the last question because we've just about completely run out of time. But what do you think Pontecorvo's, in that sense, very briefly, Pontecorvo's legacy is? Because these are particularly these other films are enormously influential.
Well, as the maker of the two great political films of probably in the history of cinema, this is something that Said recommends. But also, Pontecorvo is an enigma. He's only produced 5 films,
right.
5 feature films, and there's an extraordinary interview with Said.
Edward Said, the late.
Yes, my dear friend and former colleague at Columbia. About the quest for Pontecorvo, in which he almost puts to him, why not make a film on Palestine and on the Palestinian cause? But Pontecorvo has this will to silence.
I'm going to have to silence you right now on the will to silence on Pontecorvo because we've run out of time. So we end with an enigma. There is no enigma about our programming. You can get access to it by visiting our website, checking out the schedule on City Cinematheque and the other programming on CUNY TV. Visit www.cuny.tv. You'll find click-ons for City Cinematheque, for our other programming, and click-ons to email us with your comments. Again, that's www.cuny.tv. Pele, a very fast 30 minutes. Thank you for erudition and fun.
Thank you very much.
Okay, and we hope to have you back some other time on City Cinematheque. Great. And I hope you join us once again as we stroll through the archives of film history here on City Cinematheque. Thanks in any case for joining us today. Bye-bye for now.